When a routine flight turns into a nightmare at 30,000 feet, no one expects a single decision to threaten a teenager's life. A flight attendant, fueled by bias and authority, confiscates life-saving medication from a quiet teen, dismissing the warning signs as exaggeration. Minutes stretch, oxygen thins, and panic spreads while cameras roll and rules are twisted. What passengers don't know is who the teen's father really is, or how far consequences can travel after landing. By the time the plane touches down, reputations are exposed, careers unravel, and power shifts in public view. Stay to the end to witness how cruelty meets accountability, and why one mistake becomes an unforgettable reckoning. This story reveals privilege, prejudice, and justice colliding. Long before the aircraft doors closed and the cabin lights dimmed, this journey had been carefully planned with one quiet priority in mind: safety. For the teenager, travel was never casual. It required preparation, structure, and awareness that most people never had to consider. Every trip began days in advance, with reminders set, medical documents organized, and essentials checked more than once. Life had taught the teen that survival depended not on luck, but on readiness. Despite the precautions, the teen looked ordinary to the outside world. Youth had a way of masking complexity. Strangers saw a calm face, neat clothes, and polite restraint. What they did not see was the invisible condition that shaped every decision, a medical reality managed responsibly for years. The teen had learned early how to advocate quietly, how to explain needs without drawing attention, how to comply while still protecting personal limits. This particular flight mattered more than most. It was not just travel for leisure. It was a necessary trip tied to family commitments, time-sensitive plans, and trust. Trust in systems, in professionals, in the idea that following rules would result in protection rather than punishment. The teen boarded alone, confident but cautious, carrying the one item that mattered above all others: prescribed medication that had never failed when needed. At the airport, everything moved as expected. Security lines, boarding announcements, the controlled chaos of travelers moving in practiced patterns. The teen followed instructions carefully, understanding that scrutiny was part of modern travel. The medication, clearly labeled and legally prescribed, had passed through checks many times before. There was no reason to believe this journey would be different. Yet small moments often foreshadow larger events. A glance held too long, a tone that carried impatience, authority that felt less like guidance and more like suspicion. These details were easy to dismiss in isolation, but together they formed an undercurrent of unease. The teen sensed it but pushed the feeling aside, choosing compliance over confrontation. The flight attendant embodied the system the teen had been taught to trust. Uniform crisp, posture confident, movements efficient. Authority flowed naturally from the role, reinforced by the environment and reinforced by expectation. Passengers rarely questioned such figures. Years of routine transformed rules into reflexes, and reflexes into certainty. When attention turned toward the teen's belongings, the interaction shifted. The medication, once a private safeguard, became an object of scrutiny. What should have been a straightforward verification instead became something else entirely. Assumptions replaced inquiry. Doubt replaced empathy. The teen's attempts to clarify were measured and respectful, shaped by years of navigating similar situations. But respect did not guarantee understanding. The medication was taken away under the guise of regulation and control. The decision was swift, final, and delivered with confidence. There was no space for nuance, no acknowledgement of medical urgency. In that moment, the system failed its most basic promise: to protect those within it. As the teen took their seat, the weight of that loss settled in. The medication had always been a silent companion, reassurance tucked discreetly away. Without it, vulnerability surged to the surface. The teen reminded themselves that this was temporary. The flight was short enough. The body had managed before. Still, a quiet anxiety lingered, threading through each thought. Around them, the cabin filled with the ordinary sounds of departure. Overhead bins closed. Seatbelts clicked. Conversations faded into the background hum of engines preparing for flight. To everyone else, this was routine. To the teen, it marked the beginning of uncertainty. What the passengers did not know was how carefully this teen's life had been safeguarded up to this point. Family had been unwavering, building a world where support and resources ensured stability. Medical care had been top tier, proactive rather than reactive. The teen's father, in particular, had been relentless in ensuring nothing was left to chance. He was a man accustomed to control, not out of arrogance but necessity. His world demanded precision. Decisions affected markets, industries, livelihoods. Mistakes carried consequences measured in millions. Yet despite the scale of his influence, his priorities were disarmingly simple when it came to family. Protection came first, always. The teen had grown up aware of this, though shielded from its excesses. Wealth had never been used as a weapon, only as a tool to ensure safety and opportunity. Privacy was valued. Normalcy was encouraged. The teen's independence was supported, but never without safeguards quietly in place. That balance made this moment particularly cruel. For once, the teen was alone, navigating a system that did not know or care who stood behind them. The anonymity should have been liberating. Instead, it became dangerous. As the plane taxied, the teen rehearsed contingency plans mentally. Focus on breathing. Avoid panic. Signal for help if needed. Years of discipline had taught the body to respond to stress with control rather than fear. Still, the knowledge that a critical lifeline was missing created a constant, low-grade tension. The flight attendant, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with practiced ease. The earlier interaction had already been categorized and dismissed. In a role defined by authority, doubt was uncomfortable. It was easier to believe the decision was correct than to revisit it. Systems rewarded confidence, not reflection. The environment reinforced this mindset. Passengers complied. No one questioned. The absence of resistance felt like validation. Bias, once activated, rarely announced itself. It worked quietly, shaping perceptions and decisions while remaining invisible to those who wielded it. As the plane lined up on the runway, the teen looked out the window. Grounding themselves in the familiar sight of distant terminals and service vehicles shrinking below. The sky promised smooth passage. Appearances suggested safety. Reality, however, had already shifted. This setup was not born of malice alone, but of a dangerous combination of power, assumption, and indifference. A single choice, made without curiosity or compassion, had altered the trajectory of an ordinary flight. What followed would expose the fragility of authority when stripped of accountability. The stage was set long before the first sign of physical distress appeared. It was set the moment trust was broken, when procedure replaced humanity, and when a teenager's quiet responsibility was met with suspicion instead of respect. The journey ahead would force every person involved to confront the cost of that failure and reveal how far consequences could reach when the wrong person was underestimated. The tension that had sparked at the gate did not dissolve once the aircraft lifted into the sky. Instead, it stretched thin across the cabin, settling into the recycled air like a pressure no one could quite name. The teenager sat rigid in the window seat, shoulders tight, breath shallow, trying to maintain control as the plane climbed. The medication that usually stayed within reach was no longer there. The absence felt louder than the engines, a hollow panic growing with every passing minute. From the outside, nothing about the teen suggested fragility. Youth often carried that illusion, convincing strangers that resilience was automatic and limitless. Yet beneath the calm posture was a carefully managed condition, one that demanded vigilance and respect. The flight attendant's earlier decision had transformed that careful balance into a countdown. The teen focused on routine, on steady breathing, on the hope that this flight would end before the body betrayed its limits. Across the aisle, a few passengers noticed the unease. A woman traveling alone sensed something was wrong but dismissed it as nerves. A businessman glanced up from his screen, registering discomfort without curiosity. In the confined space of the cabin, discomfort was common and empathy rare. The systems of air travel encouraged obedience and silence, rewarding those who did not ask questions. As the aircraft leveled off, the physical signs became harder to ignore. A faint tremor moved through the teen's hands. The color drained slightly from the face, a detail that might have gone unnoticed if not for the unnatural stillness that followed. The body's attempt to conserve energy created an eerie calm, one that masked the storm building underneath. The flight attendant passed again, efficient and detached, eyes scanning for rule breakers rather than warning signs. Authority, once assumed, often became blinding. Training manuals and procedures offered comfort, but they also created a dangerous rigidity. In that rigidity, human nuance was lost. The teen's earlier explanation had been filtered through assumptions shaped long before this flight. Bias had done the rest, filling in gaps with suspicion instead of concern. Minutes slipped by. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition into cruise mode. For most passengers, this was the safest, most forgettable part of the journey. For the teen, it marked the point where the body began to protest. A tightness settled in the chest, subtle at first, then insistent. Breathing required focus. Each inhale felt incomplete, as if the air itself had thinned beyond what the pressurized cabin could explain. The teen leaned back, attempting to slow the heart rate. Panic would only accelerate the decline. The absence of medication meant relying on willpower and luck, neither of which offered guarantees. The eyes closed briefly, not in rest, but in calculation. How long could this be managed? How long before intervention became unavoidable? Nearby, a middle-aged couple noticed the stillness, the way the teen's chest rose too quickly. Concern flickered, but uncertainty held them back. Interfering on flights carried social risk. No one wanted to be the passenger accused of overreacting. The flight attendant's earlier confidence had signaled that the situation was handled. Trust in authority, even when misplaced, remained powerful. As the aircraft cut through the sky, turbulence rattled the cabin. The sudden jolt sent a sharp wave through the teen's body, breaking concentration. The heart responded violently, pounding against ribs already strained. The body's warning signals intensified, no longer content with subtlety. Sweat formed along the hairline, cold and clammy despite the controlled temperature. The teen reached instinctively toward the bag, fingers brushing the zipper where the medication should have been. The empty space was a cruel reminder. The earlier exchange replayed in the mind, every detail sharper now. The certainty with which the medication had been taken, the dismissal of medical necessity, the way authority had overridden vulnerability without hesitation. Time became distorted. Seconds stretched, minutes collapsed. The cabin noise faded into a dull roar as the body redirected energy inward. The teen's vision narrowed slightly, edges blurring. The rational part of the mind recognized the danger urging action, yet the fear of escalation, of being misunderstood again, pressed heavily. Eventually, the signs crossed a threshold that could not be hidden. The teen's breathing grew visibly labored, shoulders rising with effort. A soft gasp escaped, involuntary and alarming. This time, the surrounding passengers noticed. Heads turned. Whispers replaced the hum of complacency. Concern finally outweighed social hesitation. A call for assistance rippled through the aisle, drawing attention back to the situation the flight attendant believed had been resolved. The return was marked by irritation rather than concern, an emotion that quickly shifted as the reality became undeniable. The color of the teen's skin had changed. The eyes, once alert, now struggled to focus. The flight attendant hesitated, caught between procedure and the unfolding emergency. The training that emphasized control now collided with the unpredictable nature of human physiology. This was no longer about rules or authority. It was about consequences. The delay, however brief, had cost precious time. The teen's body was now fighting on multiple fronts, oxygen deprivation compounding the underlying condition. The cabin, designed for comfort rather than crisis, offered few immediate solutions. The absence of the medication loomed larger than ever, a silent antagonist created by a single decision. As other crew members became involved, the atmosphere shifted from routine to urgent. The earlier confidence dissolved, replaced by a frantic recalibration. Systems were activated, protocols reviewed, but the most effective solution remained locked away, inaccessible because of pride and prejudice. The plane's captain was informed, the situation escalating beyond the cabin. Discussions occurred behind closed doors, decisions weighed against fuel calculations and air traffic constraints. Every option carried risk, but doing nothing was no longer viable. The teen's condition was deteriorating too rapidly. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the teen's father continued a day structured around precision and control. Boardrooms, financial forecasts, and global negotiations filled his schedule. Yet even in that world of numbers and influence, a single priority eclipsed all others. The knowledge that his child was traveling alone had been paired with trust in systems meant to protect, not endanger. That trust was about to be shattered. Back in the cabin, the weight of collective guilt began to settle. Passengers realized that silence had played a role. Assumptions had filled the gaps where empathy should have lived. The flight attendant, once certain of being right, now faced the terrifying possibility of being catastrophically wrong. The teen's strength waned, each breath a conscious effort. The body's resilience, impressive but finite, neared its limit. The situation had crossed from uncomfortable to critical, and the aircraft itself seemed to hold its breath. As the crew prepared for emergency measures, a realization rippled through those involved. This moment would not end when the plane landed. The consequences of what had happened, of what had been dismissed, would extend far beyond this cabin. Records would be reviewed. Decisions would be questioned. Reputations would be tested. The rising action reached its peak in that suspended moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, where authority, bias, and human vulnerability collided. The teen's life hung in the balance, and the illusion of control that governed the skis began to fracture, revealing just how fragile power became when confronted with truth-he moment the aircraft diverted course. The illusion of control finally collapsed. What had been handled quietly, dismissed casually, now demanded attention from forces far beyond the cabin. Emergency protocols replaced routine checklists, and urgency rippled through every layer of authority on board. The teenager's condition had crossed into undeniable crisis, forcing the crew to confront the reality they had tried to minimize. As the plane descended, medical personnel were alerted, airports mobilized, and digital records began updating in real time. Every action taken, or not taken, was logged. Every decision left a trace. The confined space that once protected authority now amplified accountability. The teen, barely conscious but still fighting, became the undeniable center of gravity for everyone involved. When the wheels touched the runway, the cabin doors opened not to the relief of arrival, but to flashing lights, stretchers, and waiting officials. The emergency response was swift, efficient, and unforgiving in its precision. The teenager was rushed out under critical care, the absence of medication now a documented factor rather than a dismissed claim. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, alerts reached the father, not through rumors or delays, but through systems designed to escalate crises involving vulnerable individuals. The information was clinical and alarming. A routine flight, a confiscated prescription, a medical emergency at altitude. Each detail landed with devastating clarity. Power, when paired with purpose, moves quickly. Before the aircraft was fully cleared, legal teams were activated, corporate executives were notified, and airline leadership was pulled into emergency briefings. Internal communications that once justified the decision were suddenly reframed as liabilities. Security footage, passenger recordings, and crew reports painted a picture no public relations strategy could soften. The flight attendant, once confident and untouchable, now stood isolated by the very authority that had emboldened them. Procedures were re-examined line by line. Training manuals offered no shelter from the reality that discretion had been misused. Bias, previously invisible, was now unmistakable when viewed under scrutiny. As news of the incident spread internally, the narrative shifted from individual error to systemic failure. The airline faced questions it could not deflect. Why was medical documentation ignored? Why was escalation delayed? Why was a teenager's health treated as an inconvenience rather than a priority? Externally, the story broke with force, not as speculation, but as verified fact. The teen's identity remained protected, but the circumstances did not. Public outrage ignited instantly, fueled by the stark contrast between authority and vulnerability. The absence of dialogue in the reports made the details even more damning. Actions spoke loudly enough. The father arrived before the situation could be contained, not with theatrics, but with undeniable presence. His involvement reframed the incident instantly. This was no longer a customer complaint. It was a confrontation between unchecked power and uncompromising accountability. Consequences followed in rapid succession. The flight attendant was removed from duty pending investigation. Supervisors who failed to intervene were placed under review. Policies once enforced rigidly were suddenly questioned at the highest levels. What had happened at 30,000 feet could not be buried on the ground. The climax was not a single explosive moment, but a cascade of exposure. The teenager survived, stabilized by intervention that came dangerously late. That survival became the axis around which everything turned. Because survival meant testimony. It meant evidence. It meant that the truth would not fade quietly. In the end, the most devastating blow was not legal or financial. It was reputational. The public saw what authority looked like when stripped of empathy. The airline saw how fragile trust truly was, and the flight attendant faced a reckoning that no uniform could protect them from. The plane had landed, but the impact was just beginning.